a thing care had been. He compared his own list to the fragments, his neat entries of trade names, agreed exchange. A shorthand for softening and the other handwriting's colder lines about vaults and anchors. For a while he did not write. He sat with his hands clasped over his knees, and the sound of rain like a hush against the window. There was a thing that moves across a boy when the town's economy of sorrow ceases to be a private craft and becomes, instead, an operation one cannot oversee. He felt exposed. He felt small. He felt also something like that peculiar vertigo that sometimes took him when he had performed a trade and walked away. The sense that for a moment he had been necessary and then suddenly irrelevant. Where had that feeling come from? From being liked, from being needed. In the silence he understood that traded usefulness had been his belonging. A knock at the door startled him. His hand went, without thought, to the pocket where he kept his old pencil stub and a small copper token left to him by someone who'd owed him. The copper was warm from habit. He opened the door to find no one. On the threshold, half folded into a crease of shadow, lay a tiny scrap of paper. A single phrase had been written across it in a hand he did not know: meet the coop, back room, midnight, come alone. There was no signature. Jonah's first instinct was to smother the paper into his pocket, as if it were a bird that might fly from him. His second was to think of the girl with ink on her fingers. He did not sleep well. He lay with his back to the wall, and the pages of his ledger splayed on the table like a map, and the scrap of paper like a seed. He thought of Mara's bluntness, how she had once told him that grief was stubborn, and that it did not lend itself to being made tidy, and he wondered whether he was seeing the town clearly now, or merely finding in the dark those things that wanted to be found. At midnight the cooper's back room smelled of sawdust and oil. Jonah had always fancied the coop as an honest place. A man made a barrel and the world would, in time, contain something. This back room had a different sort of honesty. It was small and cool, with a single oil lamp that threw sharp pools on the floor. A floorboard creaked. Jonah was almost relieved when a pair of steps sounded a moment later and a figure slipped inside. Faye was smaller in close light. Up close, the ink on her fingers showed like a constellation. She did not look at him with the defiance he would have expected from someone who had been watched. Her face was guarded, yes, but also steady with a resolve that made Jonah think of a person who had been practicing their courage. She had not come alone. A second scrap of paper peeped from her palm, folded very neatly. Her eyes found his ledger which lay on the table. "You keep good records," she said, voice low. Jonah had an odd reflex in those moments. He wanted to protect his ledger as if it were a child. "I try," he said. "I write what I see." Faye smiled once if the thing was delicate and amusing. "I work for Ven," she said. "Don't get angry. It's complicated." Jonah found himself answering not from defiance but from the ache that was at the base of him whenever he stood witness to people carrying their own shadows too long. "Complicated in what way?" he asked. She folded the scrap of paper into her palm as if it had been a thing she'd been taught to touch. "We bring them in, we mark them. Smaller things, bigger things. The men talk about preservation, but sometimes the marks are strange." She hesitated, then slid the scrap of paper across the table. Jonah unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as the market scrap, neat, indifferent. There was a line marked with a name he knew not personally, but from the ledger's thin shorthand, where Stories had once read widow, quiet house, 2 late sons, and beside it a note. Anchor removed. Vault 3. Faye did not meet his eye. "I shouldn't," she began. "You shouldn't what?" Jonah asked. "You shouldn't take risks." Her voice was not sharp but wary. "But you're the only one who keeps track the way he doesn't. You're the only one who thinks the ledger means what it says." Jonah felt the ache that was like an animal finding a soft place in the ribs. He had never thought of himself as the only one. He had thought there were small networks of people who attended to the town's sorrow. The thought that he might be alone in a way he had not admitted made his shoulders narrow. "Why give this to me?" he asked. Faye's hands flexed once. "Because someone asked me to help, because Gideon has been uneasy." Because I want to know who takes. She cut herself off and looked at him plainly, eyes not wanting to be sentimental. Because I thought maybe if you saw it, you'd do something. Jonah understood, in the way one understands a small, precise wound, that he had been handed both an invitation and a danger. The scrap of paper in his hand was not only proof of what was happening, but also a rope thrown into a place where he might be dragged into the tide. He looked at Faye and then at the ledger and saw, for the first time in a way that made him feel simultaneously small and grown, that the ledger had to be more than an instrument of trades. It had to be a defense. He folded the scrap and put it into his notebook, and he said, quietly, "Tell me everything you can." She did not speak in florid confession. She told him small facts the way a person counts pebbles, how some jars were labeled not by day, but by something older. Some by the way the shadow attached to names rather than to time. How Gideon sometimes moved things in the night. How Elias used phrases like preserve and vault and never, ever the word forget. Jonah listened, and as she spoke he made notes not for trade, but as if he were learning a language of defense. When Faye left, she pressed into his hand one more scrap folded crisp. "If you want to see the ledgers properly," she said, "there's a room near the old Cooper's that keeps copies. Gideon calls it the sorting room. He leaves sometimes when he thinks no one will notice." She paused, as if deciding whether she had said too much. "I can't do something stupid. But I can show you where they hide things." Jonah watched her walk away beneath the low light of the quay. She did not look backward. He sat at the table and wrote with the pencil stub until the words blurred in front of him, and he had to stop. The ledger's pages rustled like something that could no longer be contained. He put the new scrap inside the back of the book and closed it with a patience that felt like prayer. There are decisions that sit in a man's hands for a night, as if they were a small animal that must not be crushed. Jonah could have walked away. He could have continued to perform the trades that were his old proof of belonging, smoothing the town's faces one by one. He could have told no one about the scraps, kept the paper folded like a secret inside the ledger. But the air that night had a clear edge to it, a kind of cold that demanded movement. He made a small list: find Gideon, learn where Gideon keeps his watch, speak to old Tilda, ask Mara to keep an eye on certain houses. He put the list in his pocket, next to the folded scrap. As he blew out the lamp later, he felt a small breach of himself open like a window left unmended overnight. He lay awake and imagined rows of jars on shelves, labeled with dates and names, some with a note that read identity fragile. He imagined hands, neat and pale, placing lids on jars with the precise, thought-out motions of men who believe the world will be steadier if grief can be made tidy. He thought of the families who had left his little trade with softened faces, and he wondered what they would want had they known that some of what had been taken from their feet was being kept in the name of preservation. At dawn, the fog still low and thin on the docks, Jonah went out with his ledger and the scraps folded inside. He walked the known routes and let the town reveal itself in the small things people do when they are unaware of being watched. A woman bathing her child's feet. A man setting an anchor's chain with a tight, focused care, a quiet argument over a bit of rope. The town's ordinary economy moved on as if it had not been rearranged at all. Jonah felt, then, a kindness that was not his own, the town's dull, imperfect progress toward morning. That was part of what he had always loved about the place. He found himself unwilling to send a wave of panic through it even if he could. He would not be an alarmist. He would be discreet and precise. When he returned to his room, his ledger heavier in the bag and his face set with a small determination, he did not yet know what the next step would be. But he had a map of things that did not belong to him alone now. He had Faye's scraps and Gideon's unease and a market paper that smelled of fish. They were small things, tangible, and that made the problem not less urgent, but something he could approach. The last thing he did before the light turned full was record the new information at the back of his ledger. He wrote in a small hand, August rain. Market scrap, vault. Identity fragile, Faye contact, Gideon uneasy, search the Cooper's sorting room. He closed the book with a breath and felt, for the first time in many quiet trades, the taste of fear and the steadier flavor of a choice forming in his mouth. Outside, the fog thinned, the town kept on. Jonah tucked the ledger into his coat and set out, not yet knowing whether he would expose a market or learn to work within it, but knowing he could not be the boy who simply collected shadows without also collecting what they meant. The light along the quay that evening had a particular quality, as if the fog itself had been put through a sieve and only the thinnest, quietest pieces remained. Jonah noticed it in the way the lanterns blurred slightly, their halos soft like the edges of something remembered rather than lived. He liked such moments. They made his work easier, somehow easier to move among people whose shapes were partially softened by the weather, whose shadows were already willing to bend into less definite forms. He liked them because they made him less conspicuous. His hands looked better in that light, he thought once, when he was very young, and even now the memory had the small, shaming usefulness of a superstition. Mara met him at the rope bridge, where the fish stalls still gave off heat and the rows of nets sagged like sleeping beasts. She had a piece of rope coiled over one shoulder, and the rope bracelet at her wrist picked up the lamplight. Jonah saw the way her mouth worked when she was annoyed, small, practical movements, a face more often in action than reflection. He liked that in her. It steadied him in a way speech never did. "You look like you've been worrying at a knot," she said, handing him a wrapped portion of bread, as if it were an obvious remedy for everything. "Only the sort I can't untee easily," Jonah answered. His voice sounded stranger even to him in the thick air, more contained than it usually was when he spoke with customers. He had memorized the ways to reassure people about their shadows. He had not memorized the ways to tell someone the ledger was not merely a list, but a set of decisions. They sat on the bridge's low rail in the particular, cautious hush that belonged to people who were not quite sure how close they might allow each other to become. Jonah kept his notebook in his lap, partly as a habit and partly as a shield. Mara watched him with an expression, like someone waiting for bread to rise, patient and not particularly compelled to make a show of patience. "You always make it look easier than it is," she said, breaking off a piece of bread. Mrs. Holm was smiling properly today. "I don't think I've seen her smile like that since her boy was small." Jonah let himself smile, small and automatic. She paid in tidy coins. That's what helps people sleep at night, the tidy coins. He had meant it to be a joke, and it landed as something softer, an observation about the town's economy. The fog swallowed the rest of the bridge. Somewhere a gull called, long and asking, and the rope hummed once where someone had walked too fast. They ate in a way that was neither hurried nor deliberately long. Mara had brought cold mackerel wrapped in paper. Jonah, more prudently, had boiled potatoes. Eating together was a peculiar kind of confession for him. The sharing of salt and hand-to-hand exchange of food made him feel exposed in a way that no client's folded regrets ever did. When a person reached for his bread, Jonah felt something thin and human slip across the space between them, like a thread laid over a seam. "You should have told me," Mara said after a while, not unkindly, "about old Tilda's little sermon today. She looked at you like she meant you something." Jonah considered how to answer. He had been in the habit of answering in small, circumspect gestures. He straightened a strand of thread on his jacket with an absent thumb. "She said the market moves on certain kinds of forgetting," he said finally. "And I suppose she wished I moved it for the better." "That's an old woman's liver saying what it will." Mara gave him the look she used when she thought someone was avoiding a necessary scrape. "That's not an answer, Jonah. She looks at you like she thinks you could make a difference." "Do you think that?" The question landed like a pebble in the shallow part of a pool. The sound of it disturbed nothing much on the surface, but the ripple traveled in Jonah's chest. He thought of the ledger and all the tiny entries written there in his small, precise hand, names, dates, a few words about tone and weight and the price exacted. He thought of the little signal marks he had developed for those shadows, that carried more than a day's grief. He thought of the nights he had sat bent over the paper and told himself he was doing a kindness. "I'm useful," he said at last, because that was true and because it felt safer than anything else he could say. "That is what I am." "Useful," she parroted, then added more softly, "but useful for who?" He wanted to answer fully. An image rose: old Tilda's shop, the shelf of preserved things, a child who had come to the woman years before with a question that had not needed an answer. He wanted to tell Mara that he had started because he had nowhere to put his own sorrow. That he had learned that if you kept the light on for others long enough, the light might warm you. He wanted to tell her that sometimes the people who came to him left with their faces softened in a way that made his work feel like a noble trade, and sometimes the softening seemed to sharpen edges in ways he had not predicted. But the ledger remained in his lap, and to speak of it was to invite Mara into a world of choices he was not sure he had the right to place on her. "You can tell me," Mara said, and it was plain in her voice that she did not really know if she would. "I don't mean for you to tell me everything. I mean tell me what happens, not the business side, the part that makes people different afterward. Is it all light? Does it make them better?" Jonah looked at her. He saw how her hands were still working, one finger tracing the rope around her wrist, an absent habit that kept her present. He saw the small scar on her knuckle where a net had cut her once. There was a kind of courage in the way she asked. Not heroic, not theatrical, but the steadier courage that came from a person who had learned to live with the sea's indifference. "It makes things softer," he said. "It gives people room to breathe, but I suppose sometimes it takes away the roughness that tells them who they were. It is a change, and changes have costs." She nodded as if this were a fact in a ledger that one had to accept and then work around. "So you ought to say what those costs are, if you are going to be doing them for people. They have a right to know." "They do," Jonah said. The truth of it made the inside of his mouth slick with something like guilt. "They do. I try, mostly. That is how I work. I make sure people understand what is being asked. But most people just want to sleep. They are tired. They will trade almost anything for rest." Mara's eyes narrowed. "And you? Why do you do it?" It was an old question in an unhelpful form. Jonah had asked it himself many times and received answers that braided themselves around each other. To survive, to be useful, to be noticed, to keep a tether to the town's daily flow. He had rehearsed them into the ledger, as if that would make them clearer. Now, under the rope-bridge sky, beneath the soft wash of lamplight, Jonah felt the edges of those rehearsed answers fray. "Because it's work I can control," he said finally. "Because it is small things to hold. Because people leave pieces behind in ways that I can carry." He found himself saying more than he had intended, "because it keeps me from noticing my own." For a long moment Mara said nothing. Then she reached across and took his hand, a brief, decisive gesture, precisely measured. It was not an extravagant intimacy, merely the practical clasp of two people consenting to a small truth. "You can always carry other people's pieces, Jonah," she said. "Even if you have willing hands." He did not argue. He had never been good at arguing with someone who spoke from the inside of a wound. The rope hummed. A cart creaked in the distance. The smell of pickled herrings came on the wind, and made Jonah think of his first client. The one who had taught him that grief could be a thing that fit into a jar. "Have you ever told old Tilda everything?" Mara asked, a moment later, perhaps testing how much Jonah trusted the old woman's steadiness. "No," Jonah said. "Old Tilda has the kind of memory that makes the ledger look like a child's exercise book. I go to her when I want to be told whether a trade is right, not to be absolved. She says the work of remembering is a heavy plough and someone needs to keep the furrows straight." Mara laughed softly. "That is an odd image for a midwife." "Everything she says is an odd image when you listen to it long enough," Jonah said. "But she's not wrong." They walked together along the quay when the bread was eaten, and the mackerel bones were folded carefully into paper. Jonah straightened a street sign as they passed an old habit he had developed from caring for other people's edges, and Mara watched him do it with an expression that mixed affection and mild exasperation. "You spend your time making people's houses tidy and their shadows gentler," she said. "When are you going to let someone make your place tidy?" Jonah stopped at the sign. The lamplight threw his own shadow long and thin across the cobbles. He felt something like a child who had been found out in a small, private theft. The ledger had become not only his work, but the place he hid the things he could not say aloud. To let Mara into that would be to hand her the ledger. And to hand someone the ledger was to hand them the right to judge, to ask for repayments, to make claims on what had been traded away. "When it matters enough," he said, which was not untrue. He simply meant something else by matters than she did. "You know when that is," she said. "You know that, don't you?" If he had been honest, he would have said he did not know. He only knew that the ledger had a rhythm, that he was part of a quiet cycle that soothed a town, and that every so often the cycle threatened to reorder itself in ways he could not bear. Being useful, he had learned, could bruise you. Being needed could hollow you out. He found a brief comfort in the thought that he could, at least for now, be needed without being exposed. They came to old Tilda's door, which was the sort of narrow presence in the quay that somehow made the town feel held. A lamp in the window made a square where the fog had been brushed aside. Inside, jars and dried things were arranged like instruments in a concert of small memories. Old Tilda saw them from her threshold, and did not invite them in, but allowed the pause of her look to be a benediction. "You two are conspiring," she said, in a voice that had the economy of someone who gave counsel in small measures. "Conspiring to eat mackerel and be honest," Mara said. Old Tilda's expression did not change. She had seen more of the town's small conspiracies than either of them had lived through. "Honesty is not a thing you can always afford to be blunt with," she said. "But you ought to be blunt with each other sometimes. It saves time." Jonah heard that and understood it. He also understood that bluntness could demand of a person an exposure he was not willing to grant. He thought of the ledger and the little notations, one cross by a name, a thin line beside another, and he felt the ledger's edges like a collar that he had built around himself. "We were just passing," Jonah said, which was true. He did not add how passing, that evening, felt like the beginning of something that might last long enough to matter. He did not add that when Mara looked at him, he had the alarming sense of being a small instrument she could play openly, and the thought both comforted and terrified him. Mara lingered a step on the bridge. "Promise me something," she asked. "Promise you'll be honest when it matters." He wanted to promise in a way that would cover everything: ledger, omissions, the things he could not yet name, but intimacy had taught him to be realistic. Promises were thin and often more about the speaker than the receiver. He thought about the phrase he would offer and chose a small truth. "I promise to tell you what I can," he said, "and to tell you when I cannot." She smiled then, a small, practical smile. "That's enough for now." They parted with the easy mutual adjustments of people who had decided to stay within each other's orbit. Jonah walked toward the narrow lane that led to his lodging, feeling the soft, dangerous warmth of being seen. For a while his steps were light, as if some small stone had been removed from his pocket. He told himself he had done the sensible thing. He had given no real part of the ledger away, only a promise about his limits. That should have been satisfying. Instead, it left him with the odd, sharpened awareness that the ledger's secrecy was not merely a habit, but a kind of custody he had taken upon himself. One that would not let him sleep easy for long. He did not notice at first the man across the quay. The figure was a pale vertical in the dim of an old warehouse, a shape that could have been a bundle of crates or a leaning post. It was Mara who, turning once to call something back to him, caught sight of movement and stiffened. "Jonah," she said, quieter than before. "Do you see?" He looked, and the shape resolved into a face and a jacket that was too neat for the quay. The man stood with a straightness that made him look like a figure cut from paper. He watched them as if they were a specimen in a case. "Who is he?" Jonah asked before he had a chance to stop himself. Mara's mouth set. I thought I've seen him before, in the market. He keeps to the edges." They watched for a moment. The man did not move. The lamp by the warehouse threw his shadow long and thin across the cobbles. It pooled in a way that seemed intentionally shaped, as if he had placed it there. Jonah felt the ledger in his inner pocket like a small, complaining thing, a thing jealous of any attention not paid to it. The man in the gray jacket made him aware of the ledger as a thing with watchers, as if someone could read the pages by reading the way others smiled after a trade. "We should go," Mara said, her voice folding into practical command. She touched his arm briefly, and the gesture was the exact, efficient kind of comfort she normally offered. "Don't let him see you alone." Jonah swallowed. He had the odd and immediate animal sense of being observed, catalog even. It made his hands small and tight in his pockets. "No," he said, "we'll go." They walked away together, not in the jangling way of those who hurried to hide, but in the steadier gait of two people who had decided that a certain kind of danger could be met by company. When they turned a corner, the man in gray was no longer visible, merely a pale absence where the fog had thinned. Jonah thought of the ledger and the thin lines he used for certain entries, a cross for particularly heavy regret, a small circle for those that needed only a night's light. He thought, absurdly, that perhaps someone had begun to take an interest in the way he kept his marks. That night Jonah lay awake in his narrow bed watching a patch of lamplight on his ceiling. The ledger sat on the shelf, its spine facing the wall. He had not yet opened it since leaving the bridge. He thought about the promise he had made to Mara, and found it both warming and dangerous. The town had a way of returning to habits, he told himself. People who were tired would sleep. He did not say, not even to himself, that the man in gray had looked at them with a quiet, cataloging hunger. He did not say that the look had been not only a threat but an appraisal, as if Jonah's small kindnesses were something to be gathered and stored. Below, somewhere in the maze of streets, a hank of rope fell with a soft thud and a dog barked, and the sound surprised Jonah into the sense that the quay was still alive with its ordinary concerns. It might have been enough to calm him, if the ledger had not waited on the shelf like a patient animal. He wondered if there would come a day when he would have to open it to Mara, and to others, and name, plainly, what he had done and why. For a moment he could imagine the ledger burning old Tilda, perhaps standing with a pail and a quiet, efficient hand, or being passed around at the council meeting like a contested will. The visions were fanciful and bleak. He turned on his side and pressed his face into the pillow and tried to sleep. There was a small comfort in the way Mara's hand had held his on the bridge. It was not romantic in any grand sense, but it was an intimacy that admitted the possibility of repair and the risk of change. He thought of the ledger again, and of how his work had given him a kind of place in the town that was both essential and secret. He had always believed that being useful could make for a kind of belonging. Mara was teaching him, in perhaps slow and quiet lessons, that belonging also required exposure. When he finally fell asleep, it was with the thought that promises were small things and sometimes kept. He did not know that somewhere across the quay another man had already begun a different kind of keeping, that a ledger of a different order was being held in hands that placed shadows in jars like geographies. He did not know, either, that the small, comfortable secrecy he had wrapped around himself would soon be disturbed in a way that would ask for more than promises. Outside his window, the fog sat and listened. The quay kept its soft, endless work of lapping and sighing. Jonah dreamed, briefly and oddly, of a ledger opened in the dark and a hand that reached for his name. Jonah had not expected the slip of paper to smell like anything other than cheap newsprint and the faint salt of where it had been folded against a wet wooden crate. But when he unfolded it beneath the awning of the fish stall, he found a small, precise handwriting in a single line, row 3, jar 14. The laugh of a daughter, night storehouse. There was no signature. There were no dates to ground the note in time, only the economy of instruction. It was raining, lightly at first and then with the steady insistence that made the nets look as though someone had laid a thin gray cloth over the world. Jonah kept the scrap folded under his thumb, feeling silly and